Ladies and gentlemen, your tax dollars paid for that hideous dancing by the IRS. Didn't Lois Lerner say she didn't know much about math? Maybe the IRS should spend their money teaching her how to add. Listen to what Congressman Darrell Issa, who's the chair of the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee, thinks about that very video.
All of those so-called training videos were really just entertainment paid for by the taxpayers. It's very clear that the culture at the IRS during this period of time was one that did not particularly care about whether they spent well the taxpayers' money, and that included what they paid for hotel rooms and many of the perks they showered on themselves.
And it gets worse. A government watchdog group reports today that the IRS has spent about $50 million of your money to hold at least 220 conferences for employees between 2010 and 2012. That's a whole lot of line dancing or electric slide or whatever they were doing. With me is conservative commentator Ann Coulter and Democratic analyst Mark Hanna. All right, Ann, what say you about that video?
Well, it reminds me of the excuse they've used for why they were aggressively auditing Tea Party groups, patriot groups, pro-Israel group, Christian groups, was that Cincinnati office was just so jammed and overworked. First of all, when you're overworked, that usually means you rubber stamp stuff, not that you focus like a laser beam and give yourselves more work and send out endless questionnaires, but also maybe, the whole IRS wouldn't be quite as overworked if they didn't waste time like all government workers do. I mean, more than ever
wait a
before,
minute, I was a government worker, and I never wasted time, and nor did my staff. But, Mark, what do you say to this? I mean, isn't this outrageous? Didn't we just get one IG report saying that, they were targeting the conservative groups? Now they're wasting our money. I mean, what do you say about this?
Well, it would be interesting to see how long these exercises and, team building activities have been going on. It's certainly, given the politics involved here, embarrassing to the administration that these videos are coming out, but this is also really small potatoes when you consider that Darrell Issa, the chairman of the House Oversight Committee, is trying to link this political targeting to people within the administration, and so far he's coming up empty-handed. He just came out on Candy Crowley's show this morning and said that, conceded that there was really no concrete evidence linking anything that these agents did in Cincinnati to Washington.
Wait a minute,
but
Mark,
he's going,
are you saying that
Sure.
you're not bothered by our money that's being used to have these people dance around? What's that got to do with Issa?
Oh, no, it does. I certainly agree with you, Judge, that this isn't probably the best use of taxpayer money. But what this does isn't really promoting the kind of public interest nature of this investigation. It's creating a public spectacle that does more to sort of forward a political agenda than it does to get at the actual truth here, which is, the American people deserve the facts of what actually happened. Darrell Issa has said consistently that he has something up his sleeve, but he hasn't shown us what that is.
Mark, to trash Darrell Issa? My question is about this administration and the IRS, Ann. I mean, what is anyone running this place?
Look, I think all of this line dancing nonsense, it does make me think something that I have not been against, but not strongly before in the past, and that is we need to move to a consumption tax. Seriously, we don't need more and more of these government bureaucrats doing this. But in part, I agree with Mark that the line dancing is the least of it. And if Darrell Issa doesn't have enough evidence to conclude that there were political audits, I would recommend that he turn on Fox News, because I got enough evidence. I mean, there have been dozens upon dozens, it may be hundreds of conservative groups that have been subject to these lengthy, extensive audits. Meanwhile, who does have 501c4 status? Let's look at that. All the liberal groups that not only were not subject to this harassment, but actually have their tax-exempt status, well, is Media Matters.
They were subject to it. They were
Center for American
Progress,
Mark,
which is
wait a minute, let Mark respond.
Which is all of these Soros-funded groups.
I mean, I think
but the point is that you can't tell what's going on unless you see the liberal groups that aren't getting it.
I think this sort of righteous indignation is really rich. When you look at under Ashcroft, under the Bush-era IRS, the IRS went after the NAACP. It went after progressive churches in Southern California, where I live and where Ann lives. So there is kind of this ridiculous hypocrisy here if you think about, that Republicans in Congress are all of a sudden really outraged that if in fact there is some political targeting, which again, Darrell Issa, the burden of proof is on him, and if he can't find that in this coming week, I will hope he issues an apology to the American people.
And Mark, I want you to look at this shot. I want you to look at this. This is the president who was basically criticizing the Supreme Court justices at the 2010 State of the Union address. All right, they're telling me we don't have it. Sorry about that.
Could I say something? This was precisely my point. This was precisely my point in citing liberal groups that have these exemptions. You can't just randomly throw out someone who was audited. For a country of 300 million people, there are dozens of groups out there. That's why what I said about all the liberal groups who have their exemptions and the fact that MSNBC and Mark cannot produce a liberal group applying for 501c4 status that was...
And we've got this sign. I want Mark to see this sign.
To say the NAACP was audited means nothing.
And let's look at the sign.
There are a number of...
Mark, hold on.
Last week, the Supreme Court reversed a century of law that I believe will open the floodgates for special interests, including foreign corporations, to spend without limit in our elections. I don't think American elections should be bankrolled by America's most powerful interests. They should be decided by the American people.
Now, Mark, clearly the president is criticizing the justices of the Supreme Court for their decision in 2010. And ironically, or by coincidence, all of a sudden, the conservative groups are being targeted because the president doesn't really like what the Supreme Court has done. How do you answer
That's a really important observation, Judge, and I'm glad you mentioned it, because let's look back at some historical context here. When Citizens United passed, it liberalized the regulation for who can be exempt from paying taxes. So you had the IRS flooded with over 1,700 applications for these social welfare organizations, and some of these were probably bunk, whether they were liberal or conservative. They called themselves social welfare organizations.
Right.
And you had one or two staffers in the IRS.
We know what the issue is.
This is what the IG found out. Yeah. And what the IG found out was that there was some really recklessness, some sloppiness in trying to use search terms to find certain groups that might be overtly political and therefore not qualify.
Right.
And so the IG didn't find any malfeasance. So far, Darrell Issa hasn't.
Okay, enough with Darrell Issa. Now I'm going to cut you off. Ann Coulter, Mark Hanna, thanks so much for being with us. Coming up against a break. And now a former Justice Department official calls out Eric